2017 began as a rough year for folks who are superstitious. In the month of January is the first of two Friday the 13th in this year. Now, I generally wouldn't consider myself superstitious, but when I was talking to a friend this week about choosing her wedding date in October, a Friday, I immediately counseled, well, October 13th is definitely out. Why? Marriage is hard enough as it is. Why would you want to start things off on a universally recognized day of unluckiness? I don't believe Friday the 13th is particularly unlucky, but why risk it? Because even the most pragmatic among us can sometimes engage in magical thinking. Knock on wood, cross your fingers, don't walk under a ladder, careful with that mirror, a black cat ran across my path, oh no. The term sounds fanciful, but it's a real psychological exercise in which every human engages, the attributing of causal relationships between actions and events when there is no logical or discernible connection. We all do this. It's human. In some cases, we do it for comfort. Like every Christmas Eve at my house, we would gather around the piano and my mother would play Jingle Bells and we would sing at the top of our lungs because we were sure that Santa Claus wouldn't show up if he couldn't hear us. And in some cases, we use magical thinking to avoid our responsibility for action. There's nothing we can do but pray about it. Let's place the situation in God's hands. Magical thinking then becomes a default for difficult action that we know we need to take. And I think it was probably something like magical thinking that Jesus was addressing in today's little piece of the Sermon on the Mount, part of Matthew's gospel that we just heard read. If you were here last week, you will remember that we heard the entire Sermon on the Mount, 2 chapters from Matthew's gospel read from this pulpit. It's Jesus' most famous teachings aggregated into one sermon. It's a lot to hear at one time. The part we're looking at closely today is Jesus talking about salt and light, two metaphors that sound nice and easy, but are, in effect, his rejection of any kind of magical thinking as it pertains to our faith. Jesus seems to be saying that you and I have intrinsically within us these qualities of radical love, whether we feel like it or not. We don't have to magically manufacture them or wait for God to do it, as so many of us like to do. We are the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world. Our task is not to manufacture these, but only to make sure that they are being used with lavish application in the world. Consider this. Everyone listening to Jesus today would have immediately known that salt was an incredibly valuable commodity. It was used to flavor food. It was also used to preserve food. There were no refrigerators. It was so valuable, in fact, that it was often used as currency. The term for Roman soldiers paid with salt was salarium argentum. Sounds a lot like our English word salary. And the same was true with the light. In a world where there was no electricity, where creating sources of light to navigate deep darkness took tremendous effort and expense, Jesus' listeners that day did not discount their call to be light. It's hard work. They also knew living in a world where pitch black darkness settled over everything as soon as the sun set, that light, even the tiniest pinprick of light, could be seen through a vast and overwhelming darkness. So, try to imagine the scene. Jesus had been mobbed by folks who wanted to see, hear, and touch him. His message was resonating with the crowd, but more than that, word had gotten out that he was performing miracles. He was manufacturing food out of thin air to feed hungry crowds. He was healing people from devastating, life-ending illnesses. He was a celebrity, not just because he was the latest rage, because he was giving people what they wanted. It seemed like magic. Who wouldn't want to mob him? But the constant attention of the crowd was wearying him, especially since Jesus knew that crowds are fickle, and it is easy for his message of sacrificial love to be misinterpreted or repackaged in a more palatable version. He didn't want to get caught up in all of that, so he decided to go for a hike up the mountain. And he asked his disciples, who were on the side high-fiving each other for their incredibly lucky career move of giving up everything to follow this new celebrity, to join him on his hike up the hill. When they got to the top of the mountain, everybody breathing hard from exertion, Jesus must have motioned for folks to take a seat. He had something to say. And you know those disciples were relieved to be resting from their hike, away from the crowds, recipients of this coveted personal audience with Jesus. They spread their cloaks on the ground. They leaned up against rocks and tree roots. They passed around a flask of water to share, and they got ready to hear what they hoped would be the key, the secret to Jesus' success, the magical words, or whatever it was that enabled him to perform miracles that made him so popular. Can you imagine what would happen to them if even just a little bit of Jesus' magic rubbed off? But then Jesus started talking about so many things, and as they gazed at him ready for a show, he turned the spotlight on them. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Why are you sitting there looking at me? There's no magical formula for bringing God's hope into the world. It's already here. What's in question is your willingness to apply it. See, salt doesn't lose its saltiness on its own. It only becomes undiscernible when it's withheld, or when it's applied too sparingly, or when it's diffused so far and wide that you can't taste it. And light, look up into the dark night sky. From millions of miles away, you can see the stars. Darkness cannot overwhelm even the smallest light. Here's what can make the light invisible. When it's covered with a basket or hidden behind a tree, when its view is completely blocked. I'm not going to teach you magical words to manufacture the presence of God's hope in the world, I imagine Jesus saying. It's already here in each one of you. Will you join me in putting your light up on a stand like a city on a hill that everyone can see, even in the darkness? And will you apply the saltiness of the gospel with liberal generosity so that the taste of hope and love and justice and peace is sharp and tangy in the experience of every person who encounters you? There's nothing magical about God's work in the world. There's only the question of whether we will participate in it, whether we will ensure that God's presence and influence is undiminished, undiluted. When I was a little kid, my grandmother would sometimes talk about what it was like to live in Hawaii before and during the Second World War. The islands, as you know, were annexed by the United States, in large part because of their strategic location in the Pacific and the unique land masses that offered natural harbors for very large ships. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Hawaii was filled with U.S. military presence, and the islands were subjected to all the regulations that come in times of war. Because the islands were such an important part of the United States Pacific strategy, everybody living there knew that they were easy targets. Indeed, as you know, in 1941, in the early morning hours of December 7th, Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japanese bombers who flew through the mountain ranges and bombed the harbor. They struck in the early hours of the morning just as the sun was rising because of the blackout. In the islands at this time, it was a rule that every night after darkness fell, everyone had to turn off their lights or cover their windows with heavy cardboard or tar paper or paint. It was essential that not one window be uncovered because even with the tiniest pinprick of light, the enemy would be able to see the islands more clearly on their radar, to have a better sense of where the critical places were, even in the dark. When the blackout was in force, when everyone participated in covering up the light, the islands could almost hide in the vast expanse of darkness that was the Pacific Ocean, making the task of the enemy so much harder. It seems strange to think about it, but it's true. Even one little light would be visible in that vast expanse of darkness. Just one. It doesn't matter how big or how deep the darkness is. If you don't hide even the smallest light, it will breach the darkness. This is what Jesus meant that day, and his words mean the same thing for you and for me. You are the light of the world, Jesus said. You are the salt of the earth. Are you going to apply your lives to the work and witness of the gospel in this world or not? And while this might seem overwhelming to us individually, it's interesting to note that when Jesus said this to his disciples, he used the second person plural form of the word you, as in you all, or if you're from the South, y'all, all of you together. They didn't have to show up in the world alone. The work of God in those days, in these days, is going to take all of us together. Jesus' question for the disciples was not whether they were light or whether they were salt. It was whether they together would apply that light and salt in a dark and tasteless world. Because if they would, if they were willing to show up with the radical presence of the gospel, there is no way they would not be noticed. And the same is true for us. Here we sit this morning in the nave of the Riverside Church, a cathedral built up on a hill at the edge of the Hudson River. This is the tallest church in America, rising up off the island of Manhattan to say something. The light and salt are here in the witness of this tower and in all of us, Jesus' disciples. If Jesus were here today, I think he would look out over all of us and say, you, all of you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. You are out there on a hill, up on a lampstand. There is no way that this world of darkness can ignore your light if you let it shine. And you are the salt that makes people sit up and take notice in a monotonous world of dismay and sin and injustice and evil. With the salt of your presence and your message, people will sit up. They will begin paying attention. They will realize that things as they are not the way that things have to be. In this moment in particular, perhaps we, the church, perhaps we, the Riverside Church, need to be reminded of Jesus' message to his first disciples. With societal pressure to fit in, to make people happy, to preserve the status quo, the church in America has spent too much of its time and energy diffusing the salt so the message becomes more palatable, or covering up the light like a blackout, so we avoid becoming a target. But in this moment when the world seems darker than ever, maybe it's more critical than ever that we listen closely to Jesus' words and consider their challenge. We are the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world. When we step through these doors, we are not in Donald Trump's America. We are in the Church of Jesus Christ. And as the Church of Jesus Christ, we all together should always show up to spice things up, to offer something different than standard fare, and we should never, ever, never cover up our light on the hill. We gather here to name this work so that when we leave this place and head out into a fear-filled and darkened world, we will remember that within us is the salt and light of the gospel. When we, followers of Jesus, persist in letting the salt of the gospel sting and the light within us shine, the world cannot help but notice. Amen.